on independence, of course, the British left, and they had to leave one day, and it was for India actually to decide where our front is. So Nehru probably knew that we had something as a McMahon line in the east, we had some kind of a claim in Ladakh area, but it was not here. So that's why he wanted to go in for a Panchsheel Agreement probably. And for the Chinese also, it was because when they had kind of liberated, so-called liberated Tibet, they had moved into Lhasa, they had moved into Xinjiang. This particular area was extreme from both the ends, so they wanted a stability probably in this particular region. So this area assumed some kind of a priority. So independent India was keen to build good relationship with China, and once it gained independence in 1940, China once it was independent in 1949, it pursued neither its claims for enclaves and gave up its special privileges which had inherited from the British. I forgot to mention that British also, after the young husband expedition, because of this great game which was taking place, did inherit some privileges like keeping of armed escorts and trade agents, and in the middle sector they were at Katok. So once Tibet was occupied by China, so we gave up those privileges. We recognized China as for this permanent seat at United Nations, and this Himalayan buffer which was there between us and Tibet, that evaporated, and that would convert into a border. The arrival of the British, as I said earlier, emphasized on converting this frontier into a firm border, and the British along with them brought this particular concept of delimitation, demarcation, delineation, etc., and instruments, etc., and a whole lot of infrastructure, and they created this Survey of India to do all this, and to create that from a frontier to a border. The Survey of India, whose help did they take? People from Uttarakhand. They were known as Pandits, and we have the story of great Indian explorers like Pandit Nan Singh and Pandit Kishan. They were actually trained, and then Britishers couldn't go, so they, on their behalf, they went and surveyed whole of Tibet. They tried to survey the boundary between us and Tibet. So we have this wonderful story of Pandit Nan Singh, who traveled all the way from Kathmandu to Lhasa and then to Mansarovar Lake, coming back to India. On his second journey, he traveled through Mana Pass to the gold mines at Thok, and his third journey from Shimla to Yarkand, and his final journey from Leh to Lhasa, from returning back to Uddalgur. These are fantastic stories and journeys which Indians, people from Uttarakhand, did for the British to try and see a firm border evolve. That's also his younger brother, Kishan Singh, also undertook similar kind of journeys right up to Yatung. So, whatever British tried to do to finalize this particular border between India and Tibet resulted in, you all are aware, in the east, the McMahon line. So finally there was some kind of a line on which we could say that this rests a border. In Ladakh sector, there were a number of lines, Johnson-Adarkar line, McCartney-MacDonald line, and these were all part of the great game. They kept shifting. But it's in the middle sector there was no line. Why was it? It's my own hypothesis that in this particular sector, by nature, probably Britishers felt that they had a kind of a frontier which was recognized as both sides, because over here, constantly people were moving to and fro. So on independence, of course, the British left, and they had to leave one day, and it was for India actually to decide where our front is. So Nehru probably knew that we had something as a McMahon line in the east, we had some kind of a claim in Ladakh area, but it was not here. So that's why he wanted to go in for a Panchsheel Agreement probably. And for the Chinese also, it was because when they had kind of liberated, so-called liberated Tibet, they had moved into Lhasa, they had moved into Xinjiang. This particular area was extreme from both the ends, so they wanted a stability probably in this particular region. So this area assumed some kind of a priority. So independent India was keen to build good relationship with China, and once it gained independence in 1940, China once it was independent in 1949, it pursued neither its claims for enclaves and gave up its special privileges which had inherited from the British. I forgot to mention that British also, after the young husband expedition, because of this great game which was taking place, did inherit some privileges like keeping of armed escorts and trade agents, and in the middle sector they were at Gatok. So once Tibet was occupied by China, so we gave up those privileges. We recognized China as for its permanent seat in United Nations, and this Himalayan buffer which was there between us and Tibet, that evaporated, and that would convert into a border. In 1954, India recognized Tibet as part of China. Both countries signed the Panchsheel Agreement. With this, India assumed that it has settled its border, the northern border, the only area which we assumed that was not settled, through a formal kind of a treaty. For India, the legitimacy of this border now rested on the Panchsheel Agreement, which it thought had been delimited by identifying 6 passes through which trade would take place or pilgrims will go. That are Shipkila, Mana, Niti, Kangri Bangri, and Dharma and Lipuli. But the Chinese stand was that this agreement was negotiated only for trade, and it nowhere reflected the Chinese stand on the particular border dispute. So hence, this became a dispute, and as I said earlier, the controversy in the middle sector, the border dispute that existed between us and China, emerged first in the area of Palam Sumda, that was in 1950, much before the 1954 Panchsheel Agreement, and in Barahoti immediately after signing of the Panchsheel Agreement. So this underscores the sensitivity of this particular area, and the Ladakh and Sikkim and Nepal that time, that came in much later. So in fact, so it's not only 1950s, 1954, in 1959 again, when Chow En-lai wrote a letter about that Indian troops had intruded, he mentioned a large number of places, that is Chua Chuje, Shipkila, Parigas, Demchoks, Sungsha, that is Nelang and Jedang, Palam Sumda, Sangcha Malla, and Lapthal. Most of this actually lie in the middle sector and Himachal Pradesh. That's Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. So there have been 2 map exchanges trying to find out as to where our areas lie or where the dispute lies, and that's one during the 1960 border talks and once in 2000. And that's led to a formulation of some kind of a line of actual control. The respective perception of boundaries of both these countries are now well documented in the 1960 border talks and the official report. So we see this particular frontier, which I described from mythological times to historical times, emerging, British attempts to make it as a border, and finally after the British leave, it's become a line of actual control. So this is also the area where there is a maximum convergence between us and the Chinese perception of the boundary. So this gives us some kind of an hope that although the dispute may have started from the middle sector, probably the road to peace, which in some manner was being mentioned, may also lie over here. So I would say that the middle sector is central for both countries due to minimal differing perceptions of the LAC, and this is where probably a solution may also lie. So this is all what I wanted to talk about the middle sector with respect to frontiers, borders, and the line of control. And I said I'll talk something about the Himalayas actually. Of course, the Himalayas have been a source of divinity for us for a long time. They've been a source of inspiration. And like we all believe that these are the ones which actually have secured us. And someone said that Khyber Pass was the one from where all the invasions came from, and Himalayas actually protected us. When I say they're a living embodiment of divinity, in the Puranic imagination, they were Himvat, the father of Parvati, abode of Shiva, and the cosmic axis from where the great rivers descended. Considering the aim and role of what Bhishma is, considering where Bhishma is going to get located, I thought that it will be relevant that I speak about frontiers, borders, and the line of control in the middle sector. Uttarakhand is a frontline state. Sometimes we forget this particular aspect because the border over here is peaceful. So as compared to what is there in, say, Ladakh, in, say, Sikkim, or in Arunachal Pradesh. But then I think most of us forget that the initial dispute between us and China on the border actually germinated over here. That was even before we signed the Panchsheel Agreement and immediately after the Panchsheel Agreement. So this particular border is as important as other borders. A frontier or a border lie at the furthest edge of a nation's edge, and hence sometimes they get neglected. It's also an area from where actually trouble begins. It's something like, code, which starts from your extreme edges and then proceeds inwards. Disputed borders are always a source of conflict, and Lord Curzon, who was the Governor General over here, had once said that frontiers are a razor's edge on which the question of war and peace, and indeed the fate of nations lie. It's a matter of life and death for nations. Very recently we have started calling those last villages of ours, those frontier villages of ours, as our first villages. I think that's a step in very right direction. Frontiers and borders, we all know, are very exotic places. There's a different flora, fauna, culture, religious affiliation, etc. But very few people actually get to visit those particular areas. People in uniform are very fortunate that we are not only visiting those areas regularly, interact with the locals over there, but we are also responsible for defending these frontline villages of ours. So these villages are actually our first line of defense, and hence the knowledge of our borders and frontiers, it should not be restricted to only people from the armed forces, but it should permeate down to everyone in this particular country. So what I'll do is today, I'll speak about frontiers, borders, and how LAC is involved in the middle sector. And I'll do it in three parts. First, I'll talk about some conceptual aspects, mostly definition as to what is a frontier, what's a border, what's a line of control, what's a line of actual control. Then I'll try and relate it to how this has evolved in the middle sector. And lastly, I wanted to speak about Himalayas, their divinity, their importance to us in matters of security. But partly that's been covered by Mr. Chopra. I'll see if there's something left. I don't think there is, but then I'll try and talk about Himalayas and then finally about Bhishma. Modern nation states have evolved from erstwhile a feudal order, kingdoms, monarchies, etc., empires. And these kingdoms and empires actually were separated by vast undemarcated areas and not thin lines which borders are. So ancient kingdoms or medieval kingdoms had a general idea as to where their frontiers lie, from where they would carry out trade, from where people actually moved, and in those territories when they were threatened as to what they need to do. Most of these frontiers in olden times were based on rigid geographical features like deserts, seas, which were difficult to kind of negotiate. And these were frontiers, I would say, were always porous, and they were actually prone to interpretation. However, this concept of frontiers today is irrelevant because most of these areas which I said were impassable or difficult on which frontiers were made are today possible because of advance of science and technology. You can move, you can fly, etc. So what has happened is from there, these ancient kingdoms and all, we came into the concept of nation states. That's the Treaty of Westphalia, which had this concept of a nation state. And nation state was one which was conceived on a firm kind of and borders because there was a territory over which this nation state presided. So when you talk about nation state, a nation is based on a common history of people having the same ethnicity. They share a common language and culture, and probably they have a similar kind of vision for the future. Whereas a state is a political entity which is defined by a particular geographical limit, and a nation state as a concept is a combination of both of these together. So when we talk about a nation state, it primarily consists of three important elements. What is the territory of that particular nation state, the people who reside in the nation state, and the ideology of that particular nation state. And when we evolved from these kingdoms to nation states, which are modern constructs, we brought in this concept of borders. And a border is more defined accurately than a frontier, and it's a piece of territory, whereas nations exercises extreme or sovereignty. Like other nations, Indian states were also used to this concept of frontiers, and it was because the British came here, then they started this, they wanted to have a firm borders over here also. And in fact, again, I'll quote Curzon, who said that in Asiatic countries, it would be true to say that demarcation had never taken place except under European pressures and by the intervention of European agents. So border is a kind of an geographic boundary between political entities or legal jurisdictions such as governments, sovereign states, and established through agreements between them. States agree upon and administrative boundaries that, and then appears on maps, and then is finally demarcated on grounds. So borders are kind of legal constructs that require documentation, negotiations, and recognition. So to differentiate between what is a frontier and a border and how a border has evolved from a frontier, let me try and kind of summarize whatever I have said, that border is identified by a line on a particular map as well as on the ground, whereas frontier is an area or a zone which is diffused and generic in nature. In Hindi, it would be something like, frontier is like Simant, that is a Viksit Kshetra or a zone, whereas border is a Sima, is a particular line. A border is a concept that separates two nation states, whereas a frontier is a meeting point of two civilizations. Borders define political and legal limits of a nation. A frontier may be based on political, cultural, or maybe a political or cultural frontier. Borders being political entities are well guarded, they are well defended, whereas frontiers, because of the ruggedness which I said, may not be well guarded. Lastly, a border is agreed to between two nation states through formal documentation. A frontier is generally through customs, traditions, and usage. When we evolved from the concept of frontiers to borders, obviously the British also invoked three more terms to identify a particular border, that were delimitation, delineation, and demarcation. Delimitation is a process when you negotiate a border in which you try and identify what your border is in terms of a particular descriptive form, in terms of a language. It's written down, agreed. Whereas when you talk about delineation, it's a graphical or mathematical representation of the boundary on a map, and demarcation is the physical process of negotiating this boundary and put it in on ground. So once you delimit a particular border, then this process of delineation and demarcation starts. And they are generally done concurrently, and finally it results in some kind of a border agreement, and both the countries sign that particular agreement. To do this whole process, there is also some methods known as survey. We have Survey of India over here, and this is basically then produces some kind of maps, etc. Cartography also helps in identifying borders and lines of control. So now what is a line of control? So what we say is when the British came here, the basic evolution of India's borders, I would say, were actually during the pre-independence period were guided by the British interest. They wanted to secure India, its northern frontiers. They thought it's their jewel in the crown. And there was a great game being played in the vast spaces of Central Asia. And it's from the Russian threat they wanted to have a firm kind of an border. So unsettled border, actually before the Britishers, during independence, they left. They had not settled the northern borders accurately. And that's a situation which leads to conflict. As I said, what Curzon had said, unsettled border will lead to a conflict. And that conflict leads sometimes to, the conflict is not perpetual. The dispute may be perpetual, but conflict is for a short while, and thereafter normally nations get into a ceasefire, some kind of peace, and that defines a ceasefire line. To give more permanency to that ceasefire line, that's the line of actual control or line of control. That's how it gets evolved from it. So when we say that, ceasefire line could be a temporary line between two belligerents, which have said that they'll stop fighting, and of course it is could be changed. But whereas when we say a line of control, then it's negotiated between two sides, and as the name suggests, it means that the other side exercises controls over in its sides of the line. So that's the basic difference between a ceasefire line and line of control. And over here we have a line of actual control, which has got a similar kind of a meaning. So this particular concept is not new, that it's so not there in the Indian subcontinent only. We have the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea. We have the green line between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots in the Republic of Cyprus. This is what were the three terms. I thought that I'll explain this to you before I come on to the middle sector, in which as to how this border or frontier has evolved into a line of actual control. So the emergence of the state of Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh as a governing entity is a post-independence phenomenon. They separated out from Punjab and Uttar Pradesh. But pre-independence, this particular geographical areas where they existed were, say, governed by monarchs in, say, about Himachal is there, it was Rampur Bushehr was there. We had the Chants ruling in Kumaon Hills and the Shahs ruling in Garhwal areas. And obviously these particular states would have interacted with what lay across the Himalayas, and what lay across the Himalayas was Tibet, and not exactly Tibet, but Western Tibet, which is slightly different from Central Tibet, and there lay this kingdom of Zhangzhung. Obviously, this was a Tibetan kingdom with the capital city at Pyonglung, that's somewhere near Mount Kailash and Lake Mansarovar.